Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 174 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. In the 13th century, medieval Europe began to hear rumors of a rising power in the East, sweeping across the steppes to conquer everything and everyone in its path. In the Near East, a wide range of kingdoms and states were coming face to face with a storm that would reshape this region forever: the Mongols. This week, I spoke with Dr. Nicholas Morton about the 100-year rise of the Mongol Empire in the Near East. Nick is an associate professor of history at Nottingham-Trent University and the author of several books, including The Crusader States and Their Neighbors, A Military History, 1099 to 1187, The Military Order 7, Piety, Pugnacity, and Property, and The Field of Blood, The Battle for Aleppo and the Remaking of the Medieval Middle East. His new book is called The Mongol Storm: Making and Breaking Empires in the Medieval Near East. Our conversation on the rising tide of the Mongol Empire, why they were so effective, and why they pursued global domination is coming up right after this. Well, thanks, Nick, for joining me to talk about the Mongols. It's always good to talk about the Mongols, and I'm so happy to have you here today.
Well, thank you for having me on.
It's always important, I think, when you talk about a time and place to figure out where you are talking about, right? Find yourself first before you get into a subject. So if we're talking about the Mongols, where are we talking about and about what time?
Sure. So the period that I'm looking at in my new book, it's the time when the Mongols are rapidly expanding across much of Eurasia. So they begin in sort of Mongolia to the north of China, and then they begin to expand on multiple fronts. My book is looking at the period from 1218, which is when they first make their initial conquests in an empire called the Khwarezmian Empire, which controls much of Persia. And then after that, they begin to expand into the Near East in the 1220s, 1230s, all the way up to the 1260s. And it's that I'm looking at. It's that wing of the Mongol expansion into the Near East.
Right. And when you say the Near East, what are we talking about?
I'll define it fairly broadly, but I suppose that the main area I'm interested in would be sort of arguably Persia in the east, sort of modern-day Iran, all the way across to the East Mediterranean seaboard, Egypt, and also Anatolia, which would be modern-day Turkey.
Right. And what you're getting at right now is that none of the countries that exist right now are existing in the same form at the time. So who are the major powers in the Near East when the Mongols begin their rise to power?
Sure. The main players, as I mentioned, you've got this enormous empire occupying much of Persia and many of the surrounding territories called the Khwarezmian Empire. And then in central Iraq, you've got the Abbasid Caliphate, which controls Baghdad itself and some surrounding towns. And sort of moving west into what today would be modern-day Syria and Turkey and that sort of area. In central and eastern Turkey, you've got a sultanate called the Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate. And then at the western tip of Anatolia, you've got the Byzantine Empire, or one part of the Byzantine Empire. But it's the Byzantine Empire at a very special moment, or a very important moment in its history, because only a few years previously, the empire was dismembered really by the armies of the Fourth Crusade, who tried to conquer much of it themselves. Some parts of the Byzantine Empire survived, and so in the western tip of Anatolia, you've got the Empire of Nicaea, which is one of those successor states after the Fourth Crusade. And then it's quite a lot of different countries and sultanates and empires to get your head around. So they sort of swing down to the coastal region of the East Mediterranean. You've got the Crusader states, and that includes the Principality of Antioch-Tripoli in what today would be sort of western Syria, northern Lebanon, and sort of southern parts of Anatolia. And then below that, you've got the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And then in Egypt, I'm swinging across to much of Syria, you've got the Ayyubid Empire, which is the empire founded by Saladin, who many people will have heard of. And by this stage, it's being ruled by his various successors. So those are many of the main powers in the Caucasus. So up on the Caspian Sea coast, you've got Greater Armenia and Georgia. Those are two other territories. But I think what makes the area so interesting is that you do have such enormous variety. All these different societies, and they're so different from one another. And of course, the big question that I ask in my book really is, how do these different societies react when suddenly threatened by this new continent conquering force of the Mongols? And one of the main points is they react very differently.
Yes, well, obviously, this is a huge range of territory. And I think that spelling it out like this really shows the power and the fear that the Mongols were able to generate, because this is a huge, this is like a wall coming towards Europe through Asia, and nobody is safe all the way down into Africa. Everybody is kind of under threat as the Mongols grow in their power. So, can you give us a sense? In these groups, what does it look like in terms of religion? Because this is going to come up as an important part when we talk about conquest and things like that. Is everybody following Islam? Is everybody following Christianity? What does it look like in Eurasia at this time?
Across Eurasia, there's many different religions. In the Near East specifically, so the area I've just outlined, it's a mixture. So the Khwarezmian Empire, Anatolian Seljuks, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Ayyubid Empire, these are all Muslim territories, but you've also got in the Caucasus, you've got Armenia and Georgia, which both have their versions of Christianity, or Orthodox Christianity, or not necessarily Orthodox, their own versions of Christianity. And then you've got the Byzantine Empire, which of course is center point for Orthodox Christianity. And then the Crusader states, which are Catholic Christianity. And so there is a tremendous diversity of religions across the area. And these are just the main territories. Within their borders, there are substantial communities of people from all sorts of different backgrounds and religious groups and communities, both within Islam and Christianity, but also Jews and even Zoroastrians and Buddhists for some parts of this period.
Right. And this is a time of really busy trade and networks that go across continents, right?
Absolutely. One of the things the Mongols are very interested in is fostering trade. Now, of course, their initial conquests are very disruptive for trade in the short term, but by building this enormous empire, they are interested in building long-distance trade links. And they do fight amongst themselves, which can break those trade links up. But there are moments of time in this period where suddenly people from thousands and thousands of miles apart can suddenly meet and talk to one another and learn about one another in a way they hadn't done previously. And so you have people coming from almost as far east as the Pacific seaboard, reaching all the way across to the Near East and even to North Africa and Western Christendom. And by return, you've got people from Western Christendom and the Muslim world traveling all over parts of Eurasia, places they'd never been to before. So it is one of the interesting side effects of the Mongol invasions that suddenly people's mental horizons are expanding rapidly as the Mongols facilitate that greater knowledge and, for them at least, discovery across all sorts of different areas.
Okay, so set the stage for us. We're going to get into the invasions now. It's 1218. Did they just wake up and say, let's take over the world? What does it look like to be a Mongol in 1218? And what's kind of the ideas that are swirling around at this time within their culture?
Sure. So the key figure here is Genghis Khan, who many people will know as Genghis Khan. He famously drew together an enormous confederation of Mongol and neighboring peoples, which then set about conquering various nearby civilizations, northern China, the Kara-Kitai, other areas in that sort of central Eurasia, eastern Eurasia region. But it builds from there. And so specifically why the Mongols start to show an interest in the region I'm interested in, which is the Near East and some parts of areas around that, that really occurs in 1218. And the story goes, at least, that in 1218, a convoy of Mongol traders went to the Khwarezmians' frontier town of Utra, and the governor of the town then arrested the traders and requested guidance on what he should do with them. And he was told, you're to execute them all, which he almost did. But there was a survivor who managed to make it back to Genghis Khan, told him what had happened. And of course, the Mongols weren't just going to let that happen. And so an enormous army arrived at Utras soon afterwards. They besieged it. They executed the governor in a particularly brutal way by pouring metal into his mouth. And then they began their conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, which in time would lead on to the conquest of other areas further west in the Near Eastern region.
Yes, if that sounds familiar to people who are Game of Thrones fans, there's going to be a few Game of Thrones things that I think come up when you learn about the Mongols in this period in history. So why did they want to take over more lands to begin with? Was it animosity? What was it about?
The Mongols believed they had a mandate from the eternal heaven. And the eternal heaven, it's some people have described the eternal heaven as sort of the Mongols' god. It's not quite, it's more of a sort of spiritual force, but they felt they had received a mandate by which they had the right to rule all human civilization, basically. And so their wars of conquest are playing out that sense that they have a right to this, that all neighboring civilizations are not simply there to be conquered. They have an obligation to recognize that the Mongols have this right to global supremacy and that that right needs to be acknowledged. And of course, those who don't acknowledge it are by definition in rebellion, whether they like it or not.
I mean, it's a big mandate, isn't it? Now, I know that under Genghis Khan, all of the Mongol groups that have come together, they all have different cultures and different ways of expressing themselves and things like this. So this idea of the eternal heaven giving them this mandate, is this something that is older than Genghis Khan, or is something that comes up around his time of supremacy?
It's something that becomes incredibly powerful around his time. But the notion of world conquest, that is something that does occur to varying degrees in other steppe cultures. So it's not an entirely new idea, but it's certainly the momentum he builds up is astonishing. You mentioned the idea of all the various Mongol peoples coming together. This is something the Mongols do extremely well. They're very good at merging conquered peoples or allied peoples into the Mongol Empire. And one of the things that makes their conquests so effective is that, well, whilst they do massacre some of the societies that they overthrow, in other cases, they forcibly incorporate peoples into their own society, into their own empire, and require them to act and live as Mongols, which, of course, only builds their army. So the more they conquer, the bigger their forces get.
Yes. And I want to dig into that for a second because I still have people that say to me, they'll say Genghis Khan, he slaughtered everyone. He left no one alive. He just swept across like a plague of locusts or something like that. But that is not how things happen. So when the Mongols, under whoever the Khan was at the time, took over, how did they do it? How did they manage the peoples that they conquered?
It's a mixture. There are some sort of rough rules of thumb in the way that they treat conquered populations. If the conquered population resists, so let's say you've got a city, let's say the city resists right up until the moment of overthrow, that city is almost certainly going to be utterly destroyed, with only a few people spared from the population. I'll come back to those in a second. And in fact, we do know of one occasion when a stronghold held out against Mongol forces and the defenders killed one of Genghis Khan's relatives. And the ruling following that was that not only should the people in that area be killed, but the birds and animals as well. A total loss of life of every species, or that's the intention. Mm. Having said that, that sounds incredibly brutal, and of course it is, but that's one end of the spectrum. At the other end, you've got some cities or states that will submit before they have fought battles against the Mongols or held out against them in sieges. They'll be better treated depending on how quickly they come to terms. So there are some societies that submit to the Mongols even before a Mongol army has crossed the horizon or even before it's coming anywhere near. The Mongols view those societies very, very favorably because, of course, as far as they're concerned, they have accepted the truth. The Mongols have this right to overlordship. And so really it depends how fast you submit. That's the sort of the rule of thumb.
Yes. I mean, that is something that I think is more common to medieval warfare in general. I mean, I think that it gets laid at the feet of the Mongols because of, well, all sorts of troubling reasons. But I think that it's really consistent over medieval warfare in general. I would say that the quicker you come to terms, the better it's going to go for you. Although the fact that they do at times wipe out a town or something completely, it adds to their legend and that adds to their ability to conquer, doesn't it?
Indeed. And you're absolutely right. There are many other societies that have a similar sort of practice because, of course, they want to incentivize future opponents to submit quickly. But there are some distinctive things about the way the Mongols do this. One of them is that there are certain protected groups. So if you, for example, are a very skilled artisan, or you have a trade which you can do particularly well, then the Mongols will go to some effort to make sure that you survive. because they want to make use of your skills. In some cases, people of military age are rounded up during a siege. They're not massacred, not necessarily because the Mongols want to make use of them themselves, though sometimes they did, but often because they want to use you as the first wave of the assault on the next city, so that you absorb all the catapults, ammunition, and all the arrows being thrown down by the defenders. So there's that. But another one is the Mongols are also interested in intellectuals and religious leaders. And there's actually a place called Moraga where the Mongols sent intellectuals. So it's an astonishing phenomenon. They sent intellectuals to this place from all over the place, all across their conquests, because they wanted these people to research things that they thought might be useful for their own interests. And so there are some quite astonishing discoveries that take place at Moraga under Mongol control, including a good chunk of what we know about trigonometry, for example. So there are some very, very interesting dimensions to this all.
Yes. And I think it's really important to pull that kind of thing out, because when you just pull someone off the street, you ask them about medieval warfare, for example, and it tends to be in these colors of religion, right? And animosity based on religion. And that means that, spare no one. Everyone gets the same treatment because of religion, for example. But of course, it's more complex than that. And what I like that you've pulled out here is that the Mongols value things like skills and scholarship because it's valuable to them in itself. So this is something that they're not going to, cut off their nose to spite their face. They're going to absorb these people into their empire and build their empire from there. Now, the people who are being absorbed into the empire are probably not all that excited about it. But when we look at conquest, it's important to have the nuances there in front of us when we're talking about it.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And it's not always clear that the artisans' families were given the same special treatment as the actual artisan themselves, but certainly some survived. And I think, yes, as you say, it's important not just to get a rounded picture, but because it will tell you something about the Mongols themselves and the Mongols' own thinking about what they think they're trying to achieve and how they think they're going to achieve it.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a time where you have a lot of really powerful groups of warriors in all of the realms of the Near East that you're talking about. People have pretty sophisticated weaponry, and then they still fall to the Mongols who, if you have perhaps, again, a troubling perspective, you might think, oh, because they're nomadic, they don't have really great technology or they don't have really great skills. Of course, they're super skilled with their arrows and with their tactics. So can you tell us about their tactics and why it was so scary to these settled peoples of the Near East?
Sure. And you're absolutely right. The Mongols are extremely skilled. I mean, nomadic societies at this time, they raise their children so that they are raised to ride, to shoot, to hunt from a very, very early age. And of course, these things translate very effectively onto the battlefield. And when you go up against a civilization where most people are farmers, those skills don't translate nearly as well. So the difficulties that predominantly or partially agricultural societies encountered trying to fight the Mongols or indeed other steppe peoples, that enormous difficulty. And what makes the Mongols even more effective is not only are they very effective on the battlefield itself, where their bands of cavalry are very good sort of circling their enemies, cutting off their supply lines, wearing them down, waiting for them to do something that shows a weakness, and then they've got them. But they're also very effective at sieges too. And one of the things the Mongols do, and this is one of their major strengths, is that they are very effective at learning and picking up new techniques from the various societies that they conquer. So that they don't assume that just because they've conquered a society, they have nothing to learn from it. And so they will pick up, say, siege engineers from China or other specialists, and then they'll incorporate that into the way that they wage war. And the same thing goes with equipment as well. And so the Mongols are learning all the time, and they're augmenting what they've got by drawing in other techniques, ideas, instruments, weapons, and they're bringing it all together. And that makes them not only very effective, but increasingly effective as they go on. And of course, all the while they're incorporating peoples, and the sense of fear they're generating means that many societies are backing away from the battlefield, even before the Mongol armies come into sight, which will only make them more effective.
Yes, and that's one of the things that I find so interesting about the Mongols as a group, as an overarching umbrella culture at this time, because they are very powerful. They have this mandate, But that power comes a lot from their flexibility, right? They don't have this idea like we know how to do it and everyone is going to do it the way we do. I mean, they do want some of their cultural practices to be consistent in their empire, but learning is such a huge part of why they are so effective. And that's such an interesting thing to me, like collecting these intellectuals so that they can learn more about, especially the people that they want to conquer, but everything more broadly as well.
You're absolutely right. As you say, there are things that they won't compromise on, as is true of any conquering society. But they had to try different things. I mean, one of the things that I find interesting is that towards the end of the period I'm looking at, they've learned about paper money in China, and they think, well, let's try that in the Near East. It works appallingly badly. No one cares to trust it. But it is interesting because it shows that they're trying things out. Well, it works here. Let's try it here and see what happens. And that's a very interesting process.
Yeah, well, I talked with Marie Favreau about the Horde, the Golden Horde, and she brought up paper money. And it just makes so much sense for a nomadic people to be like, well, this is much lighter when you're traveling. Why don't we use paper money? But for the situated cities and agricultural societies of the Near East, I could see why they would be like, well, we're only traveling short distances. It doesn't make a difference. Why would we use paper money? So it's so interesting to see even something like paper money, how that idea is changing and growing over time.
Sure. I mean, another example would be siege catapults. There are particularly good siege catapults in the Near East, and the Mongols need good siege catapults for their wars in China. So they simply lift that technology and apply it elsewhere. And so that would be another one. But certainly there's a great deal of this going on. And one of the factors that underpins a lot of this is just how big the Mongols' purchasing power is. Mm-hmm. I mean, having conquered so much territory and liquefied gold and jewels and pearls, and by liquefied, I mean they turned it into cash that they will spend rather than precious metals that are used for ornamentation or for statues or things like that. Suddenly that money is available, which means that merchants flock to them, and what the Mongols want, the Mongols get. And that the economy that they create and the networks of that economy goes to thousands of miles in every direction. People try to serve the Mongols' interests because they know the Mongols can afford to pay them what they're going to be asking for.
Right. So within Mongol culture, what are they spending their money on? What is important to them?
Sure. Well, it's a range of different things, really. They're very interested in gold. Well, human beings have always been interested in gold, but the Mongols have specific associations with gold, which sort of is central to their identity. There's a fabulous study done by Olsen on the Mongols' interest in pearls, which again is an enormous network of people bringing pearls to the Mongol Empire. We know of them sending out envoys to try and purchase birds of prey from Scandinavia and areas around there because they want the best birds of prey, and the Mongols want the best birds of prey as far as they're concerned. Mm-hmm. And so the things that they're interested in, suddenly they can buy the best of all of them. And so where previously the Mongols' great cities were wagon cities, thousands of wagons, thousands of tents on these wagons and lifted off the wagons, and then herds and flocks around the wagons. But these become a great deal more elaborate as time goes on. So suddenly the tents are being made from silk and from other luxury textiles. And the actual tents themselves, gold nails are being used to create the tents, and the tents are huge. So they're living according to their cultural template. It's just that all the products have been brought up the scale quite a lot with all this new jewelry and precious metal and textiles to make it as elaborate as possible, really.
It must have been something to see. And that is one of their strengths, I think, that you pull out in the book, is that they stay nomadic. And that culture of staying nomadic really makes them effective when they are on the move, on the march as an army. And one of the things that you brought up in the book that I hadn't thought of was that in European warfare, it's based on sieges, but everyone goes into the castle because what they understand is that that person, the army outside, wants that castle. Whereas the Mongols, they want the stuff outside the castle, the farmlands, the orchards, all of that stuff that's really useful and good for their horses. So when everybody retreats into the castle and is waiting and is just expecting that this is going to be all about the castle, it ends up being about the lands. And so it really goes badly for people who have European warfare in mind.
Sure. Many agricultural societies, not just the Crusader states, who of course would be an offshoot of Western Christendom society, are a good example of that, but many agricultural societies really struggle to defend themselves against the Mongols because they have so little answer for the Mongols' warcraft. And you're right, the Mongols are really interested. The one thing the Mongols are interested in more than anything else, probably when planning their movements from region to region, but also their conquests, is they need grazing. And in fact, it's an old argument, but it's one that goes round and round and has never really been satisfactorily settled. But there is a strong argument out there that the reason the Mongol Empire ceased in its expansion, one of the factors anyway, is that they struggled to go beyond areas where there was good grazing. So it's difficult for a nomadic society to get into regions of thick jungle or very heavy deciduous forest or desert. And so in a sense, that did kind of form a natural periphery beyond which the Mongols struggled to get any further, because that's just not what their way of life is suited for.
They still wanted to go further. They still wanted to.
And when they sent out sort of armies and raiding parties, they're often very effective, but for permanent rule, it's tricky.
Okay, so let's get into that. At the height of their empire, so we were talking about 1218 a minute ago. At the height of their empire, how far did they push into Europe from Asia?
Okay, so their high water mark in Europe, Western Christendom, was probably in 1241 when they invaded Poland and Hungary and caused substantial devastation in both countries and defeated all their field armies. But then they withdrew and they never went back. It seems likely that about 20 years later, the Mongols did plan to go back, but then there were the beginnings of a series of civil wars among the Mongols, which prevented them from renewing that offensive. In the Near East, the high water mark is probably 1260, where the Mongols advance into Syria and they conquer the big cities of Aleppo and Damascus. And for a time, it looks like they're intent on an invasion of Egypt, which at this point is ruled by the Mamluk Empire. And it's at this point that they're held. They do send out emissaries to the Mamluks saying, we expect you to submit, but the Mamluks defy them. And this then leads to the Battle of Ain Jalut, when the Mamluks incredibly boldly march out with an army of about 12,000 troops to face the Mongols. And the Mongols, at the time when they start to march, their armies are around 100,000 strong. But it works out for them because most of that army then withdraws to the east, leaving a garrison behind, which the Mamluks then defeat. And although the Mongols do try and renew their offensive in the Near East towards Egypt, they never get any further.
Yes, so they have pushed as far as they can, which is a huge amount of territory. It's still mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And all of these people are giving them tribute, and it's working pretty well for them. But then they come up against the Mamluks, as you're saying, and that is probably their biggest threat. Would you say of all time, the biggest threat to the Mongols was possibly the Mamluks?
Certainly in the Near East, the Mamluks, the Mongols really struggle with the Mamluks. So there's a number of things that make the Mamluks difficult for the Mongols. The first is the Mamluks themselves fight in a very similar manner to the Mongols themselves. The Mamluk Empire itself it had its origins in a rebellion against the former rulers of Egypt, which was the Ayyubid dynasty. And the Mamluks were originally regiments of enslaved people who had been raised as soldiers. And they then took power for themselves, creating the Mamluk Sultanate. But many of the enslaved warriors who formed the backbone of the Mamluk Empire's armies, they were originally brought to Egypt from the Black Sea region, and often from Turkic tribes who lived and fought in much the same manner as the Mongols themselves. So when the Mongols fight the Mamluks, they're actually fighting people who are fighting in very much the same way themselves. And of course, the Mamluks know the terrain, and the Mamluk Empire is very wealthy, so they can afford very good quality horses and armaments as well, which again helps them to meet the Mongols at least on even terms. And then, of course, there is the additional factor, which is that where many kingdoms and sultanates and empires had decided to submit to the Mongols, the Mamluks have already made it clear they're not going to submit. In fact, they even executed one of the Mongols' ambassadors. So they knew perfectly well that if they lose their battles with the Mongols they're not going to be sympathetic in the way that they conquered the Mamluk Empire, to say the least. The Mamluks have to win. Their backs against the wall. There's just no option for them except to win. And I suspect that probably added a quality to their effectiveness when it came to actually fighting the Mongols on the battlefield.
Yeah. So again, if people are interested in Game of Thrones, this is where the idea for the Unsullied comes from. These enslaved, well, I'm pretty sure it is. I mean, I haven't talked to George R.R. Martin myself, but these are enslaved warriors. And I would think that once they came to power in Egypt, they were going to do anything they could to not be enslaved again. So these are the toughest warriors they could come up against. And So the Mongols never made an inroad into Egypt in the way that they might have perhaps before the Mamluks had taken over. Do you think that's about right?
The Mamluks continue to acquire more enslaved warriors themselves to continue to populate their ranks. And there is another side of the equation, which is that the Mongols themselves, there are things that are happening in the Mongol Empire which makes them more resistible, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
One of these things is that the Mongol Empire, by the time you get to sort of the 1250s at least, it's not broken up, but there are fracture lines that are spreading across much of its territory. And the situation is that the various leading dynasties that are based on the sons of Genghis Khan, there's a lot of rivalry between them about where their areas of jurisdiction within the empire lie. And the Near East is a very contentious point because two really big dynasties claim the Near East for themselves. And in 1260, when the Mongols perform an enormous offensive, which began in 1256 all the way up to 1260, and that includes the conquest of Baghdad with an incredibly brutal siege and overthrow of the city. The dynasty that runs that campaign basically claims the Near East for itself, which alienates the other leading dynasty, which is called the Jochid dynasty. And that then creates a civil war between two wings of the Mongol Empire that will become known in time to historians as the Golden Horde in the north, or the Horde, and the Ilkhanate in the Near East. But the underlying factor here is that you've got two dynasties, both of whom want the Near East, neither of whom are prepared to give up their claim to it. And so a civil war breaks out, which means that even when the Mamluks defeat the Mongols in 1260 and the Mongols swear revenge, there's not much the Mongols can do about it for another 20 years because they're too busy caught up with other priorities. So that gives the Mamluks time to fortify their position against the next big Mongol offensive, which they're then in a better position to fend off 20 years later.
That's one of the things that I think is really interesting about the Mongols as well, is what makes them so effective in creating an empire is this ability to absorb and create a unified group. Even if the people within it are disparate, it's a unified group. And then part of their decline, I think is something that you mentioned at the end of the book, is this disunity. So tell us about how the empire declined over time.
It happens along a number of different vectors, really. I'll focus on the Near East, which becomes known after 1260 as the Ilkhanate. In that area, yes, you've got the Mongols, and the Mongols are in charge, and the Mongols do sort of draw in various groups so they sort of attach to themselves, and they've got their various tributary territories as well. But even though the Mongol armies are huge, the Mongols themselves are still a fairly small ruling elite over a vast area. And you can rule a huge area of territory with a relatively small number of troops, but there are things that make that a lot easier. And continuing to win is one of the things that makes that easy. If you start to lose, or you are seen to be fallible, or resistance against you is seen to be meaningful and plausible, then you start to get people who begin to say, well, maybe we don't have to follow what we're told to do. Maybe we don't have to do what we're told. And so after Ain Jaluk, which is the battle in 1260 where the Mamluks defeat the Mongols, you'd have the beginnings of a series of rebellions which occur in various different regions as people take this as a prompt to then start to rebel. And the more the Mongols aren't able to suppress the Mamluks, the more the Mamluks look like an alternative to the Mongols, the more the Mongols get involved in their own civil wars against each other, the more these groups that might aspire towards independence actually think, well, actually, we can do that. So the dynamo of conquest has to keep turning, or it starts turning the other way. And I think that is one of the key things here. But there's another thing here as well, which is that within the Ilkhanate in the Near East, it's not just the ruling Khan who governs. There's a series of noble families called Noyan families around the Khan. And these families have a lot of jurisdiction. They're often regional governors in their own right, and they've got their own armies. And so unless the Khan is extremely strong, they will want to expand their own interests. And so there is a rising tide. It's not a smooth upward curve, but it's sort of fits and starts of dynastic rebellions, noble rebellions, and noble intrigues that begin the process of wearing down the Khan's authority until the Ilkhanate itself breaks up essentially into a series of smaller territories. So there are a number of factors that do ultimately break that part of the Mongol Empire apart.
So when the empire starts to fall apart in the Near East, what happens to that area? Does it go back to the way it was in the 1200s? What happens to the area?
Well, it remains, in many cases, a semi-fragmented state. Some of the tributary rulers who originally paid tribute to the Mongols cease to do so and resume their independence. Others don't. But it becomes a much more sort of fragmented landscape for decades, really, until you've got the next big round of invasions out of Central Asia by the Emir Timur, who is immortalized by Marlowe as Tamerlane. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to ask you a really big question then. What would you say is the legacy of the Mongols? Looking back at it from here, if we're going to focus on the Near East, because that's what you are talking about, what is the legacy of the Mongols on the Near East? What did they leave behind that perhaps wasn't there before they arrived?
I think the biggest thing is that this is a time of enormous upheaval. So when I laid out at the start of our conversation what things looked like in 1218, most of those empires and societies that I described, they're gone by the time the Mongol Empire starts to fragment 100 years later. So we're looking at a fundamental reshuffling, and the whole region has a very different look. The Anatolian Seljuks, they fell. The Ayyubids, they fell. Crusader states, they fell. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad fell as well. Khwarezmian Empire fell, and the Mongols replaced them, and the area becomes fragmented ultimately between their various dynasties. But the sheer rate of change is extraordinary. And it is very interesting to look at this not just as a one-off event that happened in that particular time and space, but to think about this on a broader scale as well, because it is in many ways a case study for looking at how nomadic societies and agricultural societies, where their strengths and weaknesses lie, which ones tend to sort of ultimately gain the upper hand over the other. And one of the things that struck me looking at this period is the societies that survive, that actually make it to the end of the period, are often those who are themselves nomadic. Agricultural societies such as Byzantium, it survives, but it survives in a much reduced state. Crusader states, they're destroyed, not by the Mongols necessarily, but nonetheless, they don't survive the tides and evolutions of this time. And the same is true of other societies which have a sort of hybrid of both agricultural and nomadic aspect to them. But it is interesting, the ones that survive best are those who adapt fastest, and they're often nomadic. And so today it's, I suppose, in some ways, because the nomadic way of life has been in such long-term decline, it's not the most natural thing for many people to see that there have been periods in history where actually it's a much more durable and a powerful way of organizing human society than the agricultural alternative.
Yeah, I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, flexibility, adaptability, they've always been our friends. Well, thank you so much for giving us a view of what the Mongol Empire looked like, how it expanded, because while I talked with Marie about the Golden Horde, we weren't talking about conquest so much. So thank you for giving us an idea about this, because when people think of the Mongols, I think they think of conquest. So I appreciate this look into how they did it, why they did it, and the ways it affected people. Thanks so much, Nick.
Thank you so much.
To find out more about Nick's work, you can follow him on Twitter at NicholasMorto11, or you can visit his faculty page at ntu.ac.uk/staff-profiles/arts-humanities/Nicholas-Morton. His new book is The Mongol Storm, Making and Breaking Empires in the Medieval Near East, and it drops today, October 27th in the United Kingdom and November 15th in North America. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, we have another new online course on our Thinkific platform, and it's being run by Catherine Walton. She's one of the columnists we've had here, and she's going to be teaching about the rise of King Arthur.
Nice.
Yes. So all about kind of Arthurian literature, the development of that. And it's starting Sunday, November 13th. So we're looking for people to kind of sign up and take part.
Now, is this like the other ones? Is it a 6-week class?
Exactly. Yeah. 6 weeks. It's a little different because it's on a Sunday afternoon from Eastern Canadian time. Catherine's talking about all the aspects of the literature and the legends. So yeah, I'm pretty excited to have this start.
It sounds amazing.
And, we've got a really interesting kind of piece we're working on related to medieval English physicians and how they may have used the placebo effect on their patients. They didn't call it that, but they really incorporated a lot of the ideas on how to get a patient to think that they'll be getting better. Very kind of interesting stuff. It's a new article in Speculum, so we're covering that. And then, our columnists have been giving us some great stuff, including Lucie Lemonnier and Nick Morton. Thank you for having him.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's always good to learn more about the Mongols, right? So he's got more stuff for us on medievalist.net.
Yeah, he's been doing several pieces over the last few weeks, and I've been loving it.
Awesome. Well, this all sounds amazing, Peter. There is a lot going on there, so people will have to go and check it out. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
As always, a big thank you to everyone who supports this podcast through medievalist.net's page at patreon.com. Patrons can enjoy subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of medievalist.net and this podcast. Your patronage supports my work and the work of others like Nick Morton, who contribute amazing content to medievalist.net. So, thank you. To become a patron, check out patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Mongols to madrigals, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, on social media at 5MIN-medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life, in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. You can also find my new digital downloads at daniellecybulski.com/shop. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.